So I'm Peter Jones. I'm the Support and Releases Manager for Whamcloud, and I'm going to talk to you today about recent developments and upcoming plans for Lustre Releases. So first of all, I'm going to talk about just a refresher on the terminology we use for releases. Then I'm going to cover each of the active code lines and finally wrap up with the latest roadmap. So first of all, with release stream terminology. So we have two kinds of releases. We have feature releases, which are our delivery mechanism for all the ongoing Lustre feature development that takes place. These come out on a 6-monthly basis, and with these we increment the second digit in the Lustre release number. So that's sort of, for example, Lustre 2.1, Lustre 2.2. Those are examples of Lustre feature releases. Also, we have maintenance releases, which are primarily bug fix releases. Those also include, just keeping the releases current with things like kernel updates, but certainly no major changes of a feature nature. And so these are targeted on a designated code line, and we produce those on a quarterly basis. And so maintenance releases, you can tell because it is the third digit which is incremented. So examples of these would be 2.1.1 and 2.1.2. So moving on with that in mind, moving on to the first code line, Lustre 1.8x. So I have a few things I want to cover here. So firstly, Lustre 1.8.0 came out in May 2009, and at that time it was announced that it would end of life in June of this year. Now, I think it's safe to say that we have somewhat different priorities nowadays, and so we've deprecated all idea of end-of-lifing in June. We certainly, we know that many people are running a production on 1.8 releases and hope to do so for a long time yet, and we certainly intend to provide support to them on their 1.8 releases as long as there's sufficient demand to justify that. So we have no current plans to end of life the 1.8 code line, and if that changes, we'll certainly make sure we provide plenty of notice of that. And it won't be an overnight thing. It will be a gradual shift as people move on to more current releases. Then 9x point is that we are actually going to produce a 1.8.8 WC1 release later this quarter. This was not previously scheduled. We did recently announce that we had shifted our designated maintenance release stream to be the 2.1x code line rather than 1.8x, and of course Murphy's Law kicked in, and about a week later we came to light that newer hardware required Red Hat 6.2, which would have been fine because you can use that on 2.1.1, but the complexity is there's slightly reduced interoperability options between 1.8 and 2x releases, and so that meant it was going to be a headache for people to sort of upgrade, and people would have been forced into the situation where they would have been had to accelerate their upgrade plans purely to add, 1 or 2 new clients to an existing 1.8 cluster. So anyway, to sort of alleviate that situation, we're doing, an extra out of band release later this quarter. Primarily, there will be a few bug fixes included as well, just sweeping up with, the fixes we've had, recently for 1.8. But the primary reason for that is to provide the Red Hat 6.2 client support on the 1.8 stream. And finally, I did want to clarify the situation. I know that there's a bit of confusion about because Oracle have still been producing 1.8 releases, and they do have similar numbering to the Whamcloud releases. So I do keep in touch with Terry Rutledge and the Oracle team there with their plans, and I sort of discussed this with them ahead of time, but so basically there are some slight differences between the releases, and the key thing to be aware of when selecting a release to use, the Oracle have been choosing the content of their releases to meet the needs of their customers, and there has not necessarily been consideration given to upgrade for onto Lustre 2x releases. So when we're testing our interoperability, testing upgrades and downgrades, we're entirely using the Whamcloud 1.8 releases. There's certainly been a number of fixes that have landed onto the Whamcloud 1.8 stream to deal with issues that were uncovered in our testing. So just definitely be aware of that. So moving on to 2.1x, last year when I presented at LUG, I did so on the 2.1 community release plans, and that release went GA in September of last year. Then shortly after, we designated that as our maintenance release stream, and so in February of this year we brought out a 2.1.1 release, which was mostly bug fixes, but also added Red Hat 6.2 server and client support. And then we're due to later this quarter release a 2.1.2 release, which will provide additional bug fixes. And we do have several large sites running 2.1x releases in production nowadays, and as they're exercising the code in new ways, new access patterns, different kinds of scale than we've been able to do in our testing. Naturally, issues are being unearthed, and we are getting those fixes landed and to the release. So, I think it's fair to say that it's still relatively early days for the 2.1x code line. Consider that the 1.8 stream has been out for nearly 3 years now, and the 2.1x code line for just over 6 months. So we definitely saw this with earlier code lines. It takes a while to sort of shake out all the issues and stabilize, and I think most people who are running a 1.8 and loving the stability are doing so on a 1.8.3 or later release. And I know that we'll be continuing to do 2.1x releases, and many sites are running it today, and as subsequent releases come out, I certainly hope that we can confidently assert that we've matched or surpassed the stability that people have grown accustomed to with 1.8x releases. So moving on to 2.2, I hope you're all aware that 2.2 was released several weeks ago on schedule. This is the first feature release to benefit from the OpenSFS funding, that's, as Galen mentioned earlier on. And so I would just like to echo his comments that I know that many Lustre sites are very supportive of Lustre, love using Lustre, and but don't have the option to make support arrangements as a way of supporting our efforts. But now there's a clear path to do so through OpenSFS membership, and so I hope those of you whose organizations haven't done so already give that some serious consideration. And the other things I wanted to mention as for 2.2, but is equally applicable for our forthcoming releases, the next one being 2.3 in September, is that there's a whole range of options for you to keep abreast of our progress as we work through the release cycle. So that can range from at the low end to just sort of reading the quarterly reports that go out on the OpenSFS wiki and mailing list, or at the very high interest level where you're following things dynamically in Jira as issues are reported, and seeing the fixes uploaded to Gerrit, going through test results in Maloo, and then seeing things as they land on Git. All of that infrastructure is entirely open, so you have complete access to see how things are progressing. So onto the features themselves. So first of all, I'd like to thank these features were mostly developed due to as part of NRE funding efforts from Oak Ridge, Livermore, and OpenSFS. So I'd like to thank those organizations for their investment in Lustre's ongoing development. And the exception to that actually was the large exatters, or as it's more commonly known, wide striping. And that was interesting. That was work that was a prototype of this was developed from funding by Oak Ridge back in the Sun timeframe, but it was never, that work wasn't productized and landed And so, as a result, there was, not everyone was able to take advantage of this, and so we wanted to sort of make efforts to get that work in a sort of an official release, so that everyone was able to take advantage. And so I'd like to thank Oak Ridge and Zyrotex for their collaborative support on that effort, and I'm glad to say that we did manage to get that feature into 2.2. There are certainly a number of other features I'm aware of that are sort of in limbo in a similar manner, and because the work is 90% there, it's hard to sort of get funding for that, but we'd certainly like to tidy up and make sure that development effort doesn't go to waste, and so there's other things like that we are considering. And the other thing I wanted to really spotlight here as well is that the two of the features here listed were subject to technical presentations last year and at LUG, and now we're here with them actually out in a generally available Lustre release. So I hope we see this sort of thing repeated here, and so that technical presentations that you listen to over the next couple of days, again, as of the roadmap, the Lustre release pipeline is flowing. We see those coming to fruition in releases when we reconvene next year. And I've included the Jira bug numbers, and so you can go in to access supporting documentation for these features. Most of these have test plans and design docs attached to the Jira tickets, and of course these are also in the manual. There's those features which aren't completely transparent to the end user do have sections in the latest version of the manual which you can probably the simplest way to, if you're not familiar with how to get it, it's on Gerrit as we do updates, but you can access it through the Whamcloud wiki, and there's a Lustre documentation page that will help you find it. So here's a number of accomplishments that I thought that may not be immediately apparent to people who are not involved in these release activities day by day, but I still think are interesting to highlight. Firstly is the amount of effort we put into test automation with on this release cycle. So this really helps us. Traditionally there's been a great deal of the functional testing has been done manually, and it is very time consuming to work through, and is at risk that individual pilot error can mean there's variability between test runs. So we've put a lot of effort into automating a lot of this repetitive testing so that it can be run more reliably as things, with every test landing. A lot of this testing that was traditionally only done as we got into the late stages of release cycle is now being run, and we hope to further increase that, and that really helps us with our ability to deliver releases on time, because the sooner you can catch regressions, the better. I mean, if you're only catching a regression, after 6 months of development, to actually sort of work through and see what check-in affected it is very much more complicated. Secondly, we've added a reports facility to LUG, which aggregates results from the test database. And that, again, is a very useful tool to very quickly see patterns and trends and quality over time, and is useful as well for really, as we are sort of converging on releases, to make sure we're moving in the right direction. Thirdly, I'd like to thank our friends at Indiana University and ULISH for donating test resources that we were able to use in the 2.2 cycle. And on a similar note, to thank the Hyperion team. I mentioned in my presentation last year that I think that the advent of Hyperion, which is a test cluster hosted at Livermore with equipment donated by a consortium of hardware vendors, and that option basically gives us access to a sort of scale that we just don't have in our own internal resources, and really helps us find issues that we just wouldn't find until things were running in production otherwise. And so that really, we use that routinely in our scale testing, and that's we really appreciate that. And finally, I wanted to mention the community development wiki. That's as we're getting more diverse numbers of organizations being involved in Lustre development, there is the risk that there is either conflicting development where two independent development streams are actually not compatible, and if that's not caught early, that creates an awkward situation with a lot of rework on one or both parties required, or duplication of effort. And either way, it's basically inefficient for us as a community to operate like that. So this wiki acts as a central location where people can exchange information about what they're working on, express an interest, and allows the potential to have people who are developing in similar areas to connect with each other and exchange ideas early in the stage of development. So, and I'm pleased to say that I've already heard of an instance where two organizations did have similar development goals, and actually, by virtue of this wiki, were able to connect and collaborate rather than duplicate effort. So, I'm sure that will be increasingly essential as time progresses. Finally, this is data. This is the same data actually presented in 3 different ways. This is drawn from Git check-ins, and so the middle one is perhaps the most straightforward. So this is looking at the engineers who actually made the change by organization, and you can see that there's we had 10 different organizations who contributed to the Lustre 2.2 release. So just to really emphasize the diversity going on in the Lustre development nowadays. And I think that we'll see that even more so with Lustre 2.3, because there's names not on that chart now who have already had landings which will be included in the 2.3 release. And then I'm going to get my left and right spelled out now, but the one to your left is the same data, but overlaying that with, this is basically the chart that I include in the quarterly OpenSFS reports. So it does have a OpenSFS leaning, and so organizations who are in both EOFS and OpenSFS are shown as OpenSFS, but I hope the point is clear that between Whamcloud and the 2 community groups, virtually that's what's creating the releases. And finally, the other one is on your right is a different slice of this data, and this is actually looking at the funding that's behind each landing. So just to sort of, some of the landings for the 2.2 are of course NRE development projects, and the landing to the main branch is included as part of that. So just to really but as you can see, although that development may have many thousands of lines of code and take months of development effort, the actual numbers of landings, that's not what is making up the bulk of these numbers. There is still an awful lot of work, which is the rest, which is that the tree maintenance that Galen was referring to earlier on. So you can see where that money is going. And just to wrap up with the roadmap, so I'm not going to drill into details here too much because Andreas is on after me and he will be doing so. But the things I mostly wanted to emphasize here were the differences between, traditionally there's been a great focus on the roadmap as to what's coming down the pipeline, but there wasn't really a great deal of confidence that the roadmap matched reality. Now I think that what we're really trying to move to is the having a conservative roadmap which does, take a pessimistic view, if anything, of what's going to be delivered, and so and what's going to be reliable is that the cadence of the feature releases. So I think we have seen with with 2.2, both imperative recovery and the stat ahead features were originally scheduled for Lustre 2.3, and then as the development went at the sort of relatively, well, we were actually able to include those in 2.2. So that's definitely the way we'd like to operate, being conservative and over-delivering rather than having, late disappointments. Obviously, there's always a risk that something crops up late in the day, and certain features may in the future not be delivered as we hope. But we want to, generally, make that to the exception rather than the rule. And this roadmap isn't as well populated as, it doesn't really reflect the full extent of Lustre development going on at the moment. So to do that, you really need to look at this roadmap in conjunction with the community development wiki. And and then that shows features that are going on, and you can get a better sense of what might be end up being in releases and roughly what timeline. So just to recap again, in this quarter we're planning to release a 188 WC1 and a 212 maintenance releases, and next quarter we'll have our 2.3 feature release come out. So there will of course be an extra maintenance release, most likely 2.13, but we tend to keep the specifics of each release just one ahead, just so we can keep our options open if we do, there is demand to realign our maintenance release stream. Okay, so that's my presentation. Are there any questions? Hi, is the mic here? Sorry, I don't.
One of the questions is on, will there be a maintenance release for 2.2?
Oh, that's a good question. I should have mentioned that. I meant to, but I forgot. Not every feature release necessarily has maintenance releases associated with it. So it's not definite that there won't be. We don't have plans to do one right now, but if the demand is that we should focus our efforts on producing maintenance releases for 2.2 rather than 2.1, we certainly can do that. With feature releases, you always have the option of applying patches to releases, right? So that's, we're still going to support people who are running in production on 2.2, no question. But if you're running on a feature release, you're right at the cutting edge of Lustre development, and so it shouldn't be a great surprise if there's one or two, issues that you need to patch for. But yeah, and basically just the amount of effort to produce each release is producing 6 monthly releases. If everyone had quarterly releases for 2 years, we'd be just swamped by releases before too long.
Peter, going back a couple of slides. Okay. What do the diagonals represent?
Do you mean the diagonal arrows? That is representing that the feature releases can move up to be a maintenance release stream.
So the features from 2.3 will make it 2.1?
No, it means that at some point 2.3, for example, could become the next maintenance release stream.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay.
Well, if anyone has any questions you'd rather just ask me privately, I'm around for the next few days and here for the Wednesday afternoon OpenSFS meetings as well. So please, I'll be happy to answer your questions in person. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.